My father and his new wife tried to erase my mother from my life, so I exposed their lies and forced them to face the truth they feared. I am a 16-year-old girl living in a house that, despite being called home, feels like anything but that. The walls that surround me belong to my father, his wife, and their children, my two step-siblings and a half-sibling. Despite the fact that I am supposed to be a part of this family, I've always felt like an outsider watching their lives unfold from the sidelines, never truly belonging. The word home carries with it an expectation of warmth, love, and comfort, but for me, it has always felt like a foreign concept, something just out of reach. My life hasn't been easy, and it started to spiral when I was just a toddler. My parents' divorce when I was only 3 years old was the beginning of a painful journey. At that age, I was too young to grasp the complexities of their separation. But even then, I sensed that my world was being torn apart. The comfort of a stable home, the warmth of two loving parents, and the innocence of childhood were shattered in an instant. The divorce meant that my world was split into two, and I was left in the care of my father. My mother lost custody of me shortly after, when I was around 6, due to her struggles with mental illness. That was the last time I saw her. The memory of that final visit with my mother has stayed with me over the years, etched into my mind like a scar. I remember the day vividly. Even though I was so young, my mom was really sick. It wasn't just a cold or the flu. She was sick in a way that made her different from other moms. She was distant, disconnected, and I remember feeling confused. She wasn't the warm, caring figure I needed at that moment, and it was clear that something was deeply wrong. Her eyes were hollow, her expressions vacant, as though she was there physically but not mentally. I could sense the turmoil inside her, but I was too young to understand the weight of it. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her hand and feel that connection that all children crave from their mothers, but she felt like a stranger. The love that should have bound us together was hidden beneath layers of pain and confusion, and I felt that distance keenly even then. As I grew older, I started to piece together the fragments of what had happened. My father was awarded primary custody of me, which eventually turned into sole custody as my mother's condition worsened. I grew up hearing about my mom and her family, how they all struggled with their mental health. It was like a curse that haunted them for generations. My mom's parents, her 4 siblings, and even her great-grandparents were all affected by some form of mental illness. It's believed that whatever they suffered from was passed down through the family, like a genetic inheritance that no one wanted. This knowledge cast a shadow over my childhood, a shadow that grew longer and darker with each passing year. I felt like I was living under a cloud, always fearful that one day, that same darkness would consume me too. Despite all these stories, I never knew anyone from my mom's side of the family. They were strangers to me, living in the shadows of my life. Their influence only felt through the stories I was told. My father and his wife didn't want me to know them or even think about them. They wanted to erase that part of my history as if it didn't exist. It was as though they believed that by denying my connection to my mother's side of the family, they could protect me from the same fate. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. You can't outrun your own blood. The stories I heard made me more curious, more determined to uncover the truth about who I was and where I came from. My father met his current wife when I was 5 years old, and by the time I was 6, we were all living together. They got married when I was 7, and that's when things started to change even more. My father's wife wanted to adopt me to become my legal mother, but I refused. Even though I didn't know my biological mom well, I felt a strong connection to her. She was my mother, after all, and I couldn't just replace her with someone else, no matter how much my father and his wife wanted me to. I remember the day they sat me down to talk about the adoption. My father looked at me with a mixture of hope and expectation, while his wife smiled, trying to reassure me. But I could see through the smiles and the gentle words. They were trying to erase my mother from my life to make me forget her, and I couldn't let that happen. "Don't you want a mother who can be here for you, who can take care of you?" his wife asked, her voice sweet but insistent. "You need a mother who can be part of your everyday life." I looked at her, trying to find the words to explain what I felt. "I already have a mother," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "Even if she's not here, she's still my mom." The smile faded from her face, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes. My father shifted uncomfortably, clearly frustrated by my refusal. But I couldn't back down. I couldn't betray the memory of my mother, even if that memory was faded, incomplete. My biological mother, despite her struggles, never stopped supporting me in her own way. According to my grandpa, she has always paid child support and has never missed a payment. That fact gave me a small sense of comfort, knowing that she still cared about me even if she couldn't be in my life. It was a reminder that somewhere out there my mother still existed. She hadn't completely vanished from my world, even if I couldn't see or speak to her. That connection, however fragile, was something I held onto tightly. It was the one thing that made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. that I wasn't completely abandoned. But my father and his wife have always ignored my mental health and the family history of mental illness. They pretend that everything is fine, that I'm just a normal kid with no worries or concerns. They also like to pretend that my father's wife is my real mother, the one who should matter most in my life. They don't want me to talk about my biological mom, and every time I bring her up, it pisses them off. It's as though they want to rewrite my history to create a narrative where my biological mother never existed, where the only family that matters is the one they've built together. I tried to talk to them, to make them understand how important it was for me to acknowledge my past, but they shut me down every time. I've tried to explain to them that mental illness runs in my family and that it's something we can't just ignore. But they always brush it off, telling me that nurture is more important than nature. They act like the environment they've created for me should be enough to keep me healthy and happy, as if my biological mom's struggles don't matter at all. When I try to talk about the genetic component of mental illness, they shut me down, saying I'm being disrespectful for dismissing the influence my father's wife has had on me. Their words cut deep, leaving scars that I carry with me every day. I wanted them to understand that it wasn't about choosing between them and my mother, it was about acknowledging all parts of who I am. They constantly tell me that I have two parents in my home, my father and his wife, and that I should focus on them and stop wondering about someone who, in their words, didn't love me enough to get herself together. That line stings every time I hear it because I know it's not that simple. Mental illness isn't something you can just overcome with willpower or love. It's a real, complicated issue that affects people in ways they can't control, but they don't want to hear that. They want me to focus on my real mom, by which they mean my father's wife. I can't do that, though. To me, she's not my mother, and she never will be. She didn't give birth to me, she didn't pass her DNA on to me, and she doesn't have the same medical history that I do. How can I ignore something so important, something that affects me so deeply, just to make them happy? How can I pretend that my biological mother never existed, that her struggles with mental illness aren't relevant to my life? It feels like a betrayal, not just to her, but to myself. The conflict within me grew with each passing day, and the tension at home became almost unbearable. That's why I don't call her my stepmother. She's just my father's wife. She's never earned the title of mom in my eyes because of how dismissive she is about my mental health. The same goes for my father. He's just my father, not my dad. A dad is someone who listens, who cares, who supports you through thick and thin. My father hasn't done that for me, so he doesn't get to be called dad. My grandma is on their side too. She never liked my mom, so she supports my father and his wife in their efforts to erase my biological mother from my life. But my grandpa is different. He's the only one who understands me, the only one who sees the truth of the situation. He's kept in touch with my mom secretly all these years, checking in on her to see how she's doing. He's my lifeline to her, the one connection I have to the woman who gave me life. Without him, I would feel completely alone, cut off from my past and my identity. Our conversations are the only thing that keeps me grounded, reminding me of who I am and where I come from. I know I'm mentally ill. I can feel it inside me like a storm that's always brewing just beneath the surface. I already have some issues going on, and I've tried to talk to my father about it, but he just brushes it off, telling me I'm imagining things. When I told him that's exactly the problem, he didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to face the fact that his daughter might be suffering from the same thing that plagued her mother. It's as though acknowledging my mental health would mean acknowledging the truth about my biological mother, and that's something he's not willing to do. Like carrying a heavy burden that no one else can see, but that affects every aspect of my life. Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating under the pressure, unable to breathe, unable to find any relief. The breaking point came last week when they caught me searching my mom's name online. They were furious, telling me to drop it and stop disrespecting my real mom, the woman who raised me and is the reason I am who I am. They accused me of looking for ways to push her away, of trying to create distance between us. But what they don't understand is that the distance has always been there. It's a chasm that can't be bridged no matter how hard they try to convince me otherwise. The more they tried to force their version of the truth on me, the more I felt the need to push back, to assert my own identity. And that's when I lost it. I couldn't hold it in any longer. All the anger, frustration, and hurt that I had been keeping inside for so long came pouring out in a torrent of words. I started screaming at them, telling them that she's not my mom and never will be. I told them that she didn't pass her DNA on to me, and that it's not her medical history that's relevant to mine. I screamed that she can't save me from mental illness and that they can't just ignore the problem and hope it won't happen. They tried to stop me, but I wouldn't let them. I kept going until I made it very clear just how angry I was and how I would blame them if my mental health got so bad that it became harder to treat. I wanted them to understand the gravity of the situation, to realize that this wasn't something they could just sweep under the rug. My words were like a dam breaking, releasing all the emotions I had been holding back for years. They were madder than I had ever seen them. Their faces were red with anger, and I could see the rage in their eyes. But I didn't care. I needed to say what I had been holding in for so long, and I wasn't going to stop until I got it all out. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered truth, and for the first time, I felt like I was truly standing up for myself. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, even though I knew the consequences of my outburst would be severe, especially because the other kids were in the house and heard everything. I knew they would be shocked, maybe even scared, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I had to stand up for myself, for my mental health, and for the truth of who I am and where I come from. I needed them to understand that my silence was no longer an option, that I would no longer be complicit in their denial of my reality. The truth was out and there was no going back. Now, things are even more strained in the house. My father and his wife are furious with me, and the tension is palpable. It's like walking on eggshells, never knowing when something might set them off again. But at least I finally said what I needed to say. At least I finally made them understand that I won't be silenced anymore. My mental health is real and is something that needs to be addressed, not ignored. I know that this is just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but I'm ready to face it head on no matter how hard it gets. As for my biological mother, she may not be in my life physically, but she's still a part of me. I'll never forget her, and I'll never let anyone take away the connection I have with her. No matter what my father and his wife say, she's my mom, and she always will be. That's something they can't take away from me, no matter how hard they try. The bond between a mother and her child is something that transcends time and space, and it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. In the days that followed the confrontation, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger and frustration that had been boiling inside me for so long had finally erupted, but instead of feeling relief, I felt a sense of emptiness. It was as though I had unleashed all of my emotions only to be left with a hollow ache in my chest. I started to question everything: my relationship with my father, my connection to my biological mother, and even my own identity. Who was I, really? Was I the product of my upbringing, shaped by the environment my father and his wife had created for me? Or was I the result of my genetics, carrying the legacy of my mother's struggles with mental illness? These were questions that haunted me, questions that I didn't have the answers to. At school, I felt like a different person. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about what had happened. How could I explain the turmoil inside me when I didn't fully understand it myself? I started to withdraw, isolating myself from the people around me. It was easier that way, easier to pretend that everything was fine when in reality my world was falling apart. The walls I built around myself were my only defense against the overwhelming sense of despair that threatened to consume me. My grades began to slip, and I found it difficult to concentrate in class. The teachers noticed, but they didn't push me. I think they sensed that something was wrong, but they didn't know how to approach me. I was grateful for that, grateful that they didn't pry into my personal life. The last thing I needed was more people asking questions I couldn't answer. I felt like I was living in a fog, disconnected from everything and everyone around me. The only thing that seemed real was the pain inside me, a pain that I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. At home, the tension only grew worse. My father and his wife barely spoke to me, and when they did, their words were laced with anger and resentment. It was clear that they were still furious about what had happened, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between us. Part of me didn't want to. Part of me was still so angry, so hurt, that I couldn't bring myself to reach out to them. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between the desire to mend things and the need to hold onto my anger. I didn't know which way to turn, and the uncertainty was terrifying. But there was another part of me, a small, fragile part, that longed for their acceptance, for their love. I wanted to be a part of their family, to feel like I belonged. But how could I belong when they refused to acknowledge who I really was? How could I be a part of their world when they wanted to erase the most important part of me? The conflict tore me apart, leaving me feeling lost and alone, with no clear path forward. The only solace I found was in my conversations with my grandpa. He was the one person who understood, the one person who didn't judge me for my feelings. He would call me late at night after everyone else had gone to bed, and we would talk for hours. He would tell me stories about my mom, about the person she was before the illness took hold. He would remind me that I was strong, that I had inherited more than just her struggles. I had inherited her resilience, her spirit. His words were like a balm to my wounded soul, offering me a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Those conversations were a lifeline for me, a reminder that I wasn't alone. But even with his support, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation, the sense that I was trapped in a world where I didn't belong. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and still the tension at home remained. It was like a never-ending cycle of anger and hurt, with no resolution in sight. I felt like I was drowning, struggling to keep my head above water, but there was no one to save me. I began to wonder if things would ever get better, if my father and his wife would ever truly understand me, or if I was destined to always be the outsider, the girl who didn't quite fit in. It was a lonely thought, one that kept me up at night, staring at the ceiling, searching for answers that never came. The future seemed bleak and uncertain, and I didn't know how to navigate the storm that lay ahead. But despite everything, I refused to give up. I refused to let them silence me, to let them dictate who I was or who I should be. I knew that my journey wasn't over, that I had a long road ahead of me, but I was determined to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward, even when the path seemed impossible. Because in the end, I realized that the only person who could define me was me. Not my father, not his wife, not anyone else. I had the power to shape my own destiny, to decide who I wanted to be. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. As I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would keep fighting, that I would stay true to who I am, no matter what. I promised that I would hold onto the connection I had with my mother, that I would honor her memory even if no one else did. And most importantly, I promised that I would take care of my mental health, that I would seek the help I needed, no matter how hard it was. I knew wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face the challenges ahead because I knew that I was worth it, that my life was worth fighting for. The days that followed were difficult, but I took them one step at a time. I started to reach out for help, finding support in unexpected places. My grandpa continued to be my rock, and I also found comfort in therapy where I could talk about my feelings without fear of judgment. And slowly, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece, finding strength in my own resilience. I knew I wasn't alone in my struggles, and that gave me the courage to keep going. Looking back, I can see how far I've come. The journey is far from over, but I'm no longer the scared, isolated girl I once was. I've learned to stand up for myself, to embrace my identity, and to take control of my own destiny. And while the pain of my past still lingers, I found a way to move forward, to find hope and healing in the midst of the storm. My story is one of survival, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child, and that is something no one can ever take away from me.